By mid-1775, the colonies had entered a period of transformation in which ordinary citizens were becoming politically conscious in unprecedented ways. Political engagement was no longer limited to elites or assembly members. Farmers, tradespeople, artisans, and women were all involved in discussions about governance, taxation, and rights. Public meetings, petitions, and pamphlets encouraged debate and participation. This widespread involvement gave the resistance movement depth and resilience. Local governments and committees now assumed responsibilities that had previously been the domain of royal authorities. They monitored compliance with boycotts, organized supplies, and even settled disputes. In many communities, these committees became the de facto government, providing leadership, structure, and legitimacy. Their existence demonstrated that Americans were capable of self-governance and prepared the colonies for the political and logistical challenges of war. The ideological framework underpinning these changes was equally important. Colonial leaders frequently referenced Enlightenment principles, emphasizing natural rights, the social contract, and the necessity of government to protect liberty and property. These ideas were widely disseminated through print culture, sermons, and public discourse. As a result, resistance to Britain was framed not merely as a reaction to taxes or laws, but as a principled defense of fundamental human rights. Economic factors continued to reinforce revolutionary sentiment. British trade restrictions and taxation disrupted colonial commerce, threatening livelihoods in every region. Merchants worried about profits, farmers feared losing markets, and artisans struggled to obtain materials. Economic pressures transformed abstract political grievances into tangible concerns that affected daily life. Resistance was therefore rooted in both principle and practical necessity. Frontier communities added another dimension to the growing movement. Settlers in western regions frequently encountered restrictions on land acquisition and expansion, imposed by British authorities. They viewed these policies as an infringement on their opportunity and freedom. Frontier colonists often became vocal supporters of the revolutionary cause, not only to protect local interests, but also to assert the broader principle that the colonies should control their own destinies. The presence of British troops in colonial cities heightened tension and anxiety. Soldiers patrolled streets, guarded officials, and enforced laws in ways that many colonists interpreted as oppressive. Events like the Boston Massacre were widely publicized and used to highlight the dangers of standing armies in peacetime. The image of armed troops confronting unarmed citizens reinforced the belief that resistance was necessary to preserve liberty. At the same time, the colonies developed a sense of shared identity. Committees, militias, and intercolonial correspondence fostered communication and trust among diverse communities. People began to see themselves as part of a larger political entity rather than isolated colonies. This emerging identity helped create unity across regions, from New England towns to southern plantations. It was this sense of collective purpose that allowed coordinated resistance to succeed. Religious influences reinforced political motivations. Many ministers encouraged active participation in civic life and emphasized moral responsibility. Sermons often framed British actions as morally wrong, linking political resistance to ethical duty. This religious dimension helped sustain motivation and justified action in the eyes of ordinary citizens. The intellectual environment of the colonies also played a central role. Writings by figures such as John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau provided frameworks for understanding government, authority, and liberty. These ideas influenced leaders and ordinary citizens alike, giving structure and coherence to the revolutionary movement. Colonists began to see their struggle not just as a local dispute, but as part of a broader fight for natural rights and just government. By the time fighting began at Lexington and Concord, the colonies had developed the organizational, ideological, and cultural foundations necessary for sustained resistance. They were not reacting spontaneously. They were responding to a decade or more of cumulative political, social, and economic pressures. The revolution was the logical outcome of a process that had been underway for generations. Fueled by a combination of experience, ideas, and necessity, the deeper causes of the revolution: local governance, Economic pressures, ideological development, shared identity, religious influence, and fear of losing liberty created a society ready for self-determination. These factors, working together, ensured that once the first shots were fired, there would be no turning back. The American colonies had already begun to see themselves as a distinct, capable, and determined society, capable of shaping their own future independent of Britain. As the colonies moved deeper into the mid-1770s, the question of authority became central to every conversation. For decades, the British Empire had permitted a degree of autonomy that allowed colonial governments to develop their own traditions, practices, and expectations. When Britain attempted to reassert greater control, colonists perceived it not simply as political interference, but as a violation of the established relationship. To them, British leaders were attempting to rewrite the unwritten rules that had governed colonial life for generations. One prominent example was the growing conflict between royal governors and colonial assemblies. Governors appointed by the Crown were expected to enforce British policies. Assemblies, elected by colonists, were responsible for local governance, taxation, and lawmaking. When Britain demanded stricter enforcement of imperial laws, assemblies resisted, often refusing funding, blocking legislation, or issuing protests. The resulting standoff demonstrated a deeper truth. Many colonists increasingly viewed their assemblies, not the royal governors, as the true representatives of their interests. The structure of colonial society also pushed the colonies toward independence. Unlike many European nations, the colonies lacked a rigid class system. While wealth and status existed, social mobility was significantly higher. A laborer could become a landowner. An apprentice could become a respected artisan. A farmer's son could enter politics. This fluidity created a culture that valued merit, opportunity, and local influence. British attempts to impose greater hierarchical control clashed with this evolving American social landscape. Education and literacy played a major role as well. Colonial societies had high literacy rates compared to many parts of Europe. Printed newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsides circulated widely. Ordinary citizens were accustomed to reading, debating, and forming opinions about public matters. This literacy enabled revolutionary ideas to spread quickly, but it also created a population that expected transparency from government. When British policies appeared arbitrary or coercive, the widespread ability to read and discuss those policies amplified. Resistance. The colonial economy added another layer of complexity. The American colonies had become strategically important to Britain, providing raw materials, markets, and revenue. Yet many colonists believed the economic relationship should be mutually beneficial, not unbalanced. They resented policies that forced them to trade exclusively with Britain or restricted manufacturing. These limitations were seen as obstacles to economic self-sufficiency and personal prosperity. Economic frustration gradually merged with political grievances, creating a powerful foundation for revolutionary thought. Agricultural communities felt the tensions as much as merchants and artisans. Farmers relied on stable markets for crops such as wheat, tobacco, rice, and indigo. British trade regulations, naval blockades, and sudden policy changes disrupted these markets. Every disruption threatened livelihoods and families. For many farmers, resistance to Britain was not abstract, it was directly tied to the survival of their communities. As more rural colonists embraced the cause, the movement gained breadth and momentum. The legal system further contributed to rising unrest. Colonists had long relied on juries, local courts, and common law traditions to resolve disputes. When Britain expanded the use of admiralty courts, courts without juries, to prosecute smuggling cases, colonists interpreted this as a direct attack on traditional rights. The absence of juries, combined with judges appointed and paid by the Crown, created fear that justice would no longer be impartial. This fear spread rapidly, reinforcing the belief that British authority was becoming arbitrary and unjust. Religion remained a significant force. Many colonial ministers spoke openly about moral responsibility in political affairs. They encouraged congregations to defend liberty, uphold justice, and resist tyranny. These messages were especially powerful in New England, where church attendance was high and sermons carried social weight. Ministers did not advocate violence. Instead, they framed resistance as righteous and lawful. Their voices helped unify communities and gave moral legitimacy to revolutionary thinking. Another crucial factor was generational change. By the 1770s, most young adults in the colonies had been born in America, not Britain. They had no personal memory of life under direct British rule and identified more strongly with their local communities than with the distant empire. This generational shift reshaped attitudes about loyalty. While older colonists often sought compromise, younger colonists increasingly sought transformation. Their enthusiasm, energy, and boldness became vital assets for the revolutionary movement. Communications networks also expanded rapidly. Writers carried letters across colonies. Newspapers reprinted essays from distant towns, and committee meetings shared developments. This constant exchange of information allowed colonies to coordinate responses, avoid isolation, and build mutual trust. It also meant that every new policy, every military movement, and every British action became the subject of immediate public scrutiny. Information itself became a kind of resistance. In addition, the sheer physical distance between Britain and America made governance challenging. Crossing the Atlantic could take several weeks or months, depending on weather. Decisions made in London were often outdated by the time they arrived. This delay created frustration on both sides. British leaders felt the colonies were uncooperative. Colonists felt Britain did not understand their circumstances. The growing realization that effective governance required local control strengthened the idea that independence was not only desirable, but necessary. By the mid-1770s, these factors, political conflict, social mobility, literacy, economic pressure, religious influence, generational change, communication networks, and geographic distance combined to create an environment in which revolutionary ideas could thrive. The colonies were increasingly acting as a unified society. They were discovering that their values, systems, and aspirations diverged from those of the empire. The question was no longer whether conflict would come, but how far it would go. By the time colonial leaders met for the First and Second Continental Congresses, the political landscape had already shifted dramatically. What began as a movement of protest had transformed into a coordinated effort to defend colonial rights. Delegates from different regions arrived with different priorities, but they shared a growing belief that unified action was essential. The very existence of the Congress symbolized a new direction, a collective voice emerging from 13 distinct colonies. Within the Congress, debates were intense. Some delegates argued for reconciliation with Britain, believing that negotiations could restore harmony. Others believed that the relationship was beyond repair. What united them, however, was a commitment to presenting a coherent response to British policies. Through discussion, compromise, and shared purpose, they developed strategies that shaped the course of the resistance. These discussions helped the colonies realize that they were stronger when acting together. The Congress also revealed a powerful ideological transformation taking place across the colonies. Many delegates and ordinary citizens no longer viewed the conflict in narrow terms of taxes or trade restrictions. Instead, they saw it as a question of natural rights, political liberty, and the proper role of government. This shift allowed the movement to broaden its appeal. It was no longer a quarrel between merchants and lawmakers. It was a universal struggle for freedom and self-determination. One of the most important developments during this period was the increasing role of militias. Local militias had always existed, but now they became central to the revolutionary cause. Towns organized regular drilling sessions, trained volunteers, and stockpiled weapons. These militias were more than military groups. They were symbols of community action and readiness. They embodied the principle that ordinary citizens could defend their rights without relying on a distant government or foreign army. The emergence of militia culture also reflected a deeper belief that self-defense was tied to self-governance. Colonists argued that a people capable of defending themselves were also capable of governing themselves. Fear of standing armies, long a concern in both colonial and British political thought, strengthened this belief. Colonists viewed British troop deployments as signs of potential oppression, while local militias represented community protection and accountability. Economic self-reliance was another growing theme. As boycotts and non-importation agreements took hold, Americans began producing more of their own goods. Homespun fabric, colonial manufactured tools, and locally grown crops reduced dependence on British imports. This movement encouraged unity and pride. It also taught colonists that they could sustain themselves without imperial oversight. Every item made at home became a small act of resistance and a reminder of the colonies' potential independence. Women played a crucial role in this developing economic culture. They produced textiles, managed households, supported boycotts, and participated in community gatherings. Their contributions often determined whether resistance strategies succeeded or failed. Although they did not hold formal political power, women's participation showed that the movement had spread to every layer of society. Their involvement strengthened the idea that the struggle was collective, affecting entire families and communities. Meanwhile, the printed word continued to shape public opinion. Newspapers reprinted speeches, resolutions, and essays that explained the stakes of the conflict. Printers became essential figures in the movement, ensuring that ideas reached towns, farms, and frontier settlements. Pamphlets, especially influential works by colonial thinkers, framed the resistance in philosophical terms. They argued that when a government violated natural rights, the people were justified in resisting. These writings expanded the conversation from local grievances to universal principles. Britain's response to growing colonial organization was often forceful. Parliament passed additional measures aimed at reasserting control, while royal officials warned that challenges to authority would not be tolerated. These actions, intended to restore order, often had the opposite effect. Each new restriction convinced more colonists that Britain was not merely misinformed, it was intentionally disregarding colonial concerns. This perception deepened mistrust and made conflict more likely. The military encounters at Lexington and Concord accelerated everything. Once shots were fired, the colonies faced a new reality. Political debate alone could no longer resolve the crisis. But the rapid mobilization of militias after the battles demonstrated the strength of the networks that had developed over the previous decade. Communities responded with speed, coordination, and determination. They were not prepared for a full-scale war, but they were ready to defend their rights. The battles also revealed that the colonies had reached a point of no return. British leaders believed they could suppress resistance through military force. Colonists believed they were defending fundamental liberties. Neither side trusted the other, and neither was willing to yield. As a result, the gap between compromise and war closed rapidly. In the months that followed, colonial leaders began to discuss independence more openly. What had once been unthinkable now seemed necessary. Many colonists came to believe that only complete separation could guarantee their rights. The idea of independence spread from pamphlets to taverns, from sermons to town meetings, and from political assemblies to private conversations. By this stage, the revolution was no longer a reaction to specific policies. It had become a movement built on shared experience, common principles, and a growing sense of national identity. The colonies had developed economically, socially, and politically in ways that set them apart from Britain. And as conflict intensified, the belief that they should govern themselves became increasingly widespread. The desire for independence was not sudden. It emerged from years of evolving values, expanding participation, and deepening frustrations. The events of the mid-1770s brought these forces together, creating a momentum that would soon shape the birth of a new nation. As the colonies continued toward open resistance, one of the most transformative developments was the changing relationship between ordinary people and political authority. Colonists who had once deferred to royal officials or wealthy elites now believed their voices carried equal weight in matters of public concern. This shift did not happen overnight. It grew gradually, shaped by long-standing traditions of town meetings, church gatherings, and local decision-making. These practices had accustomed Americans to an environment where everyday citizens influenced community affairs. This grassroots, Political culture formed the backbone of the revolutionary movement. When Britain introduced new taxes or regulations, colonists debated them publicly. When Parliament passed restrictive acts, communities drafted resolutions and circulated petitions. When boycotts were announced, enforcement often depended on voluntary compliance overseen by neighbors rather than by officials. This system of local cooperation strengthened trust and created a sense of shared purpose. People believed they were defending not only their own rights, but the rights of their entire community. One key aspect of this emerging political identity was the belief that government should be accountable to the people it governed. Colonists repeatedly argued that British officials and institutions were too distant, unresponsive, or unsympathetic to their needs. They felt that decisions affecting their daily lives were made thousands of miles away by individuals unfamiliar with American circumstances. This sentiment grew particularly strong after the enforcement of the coercive acts, which convinced many colonists that Britain had abandoned any meaningful dialogue. The British Empire, for its part, viewed the colonies through a different lens. British leaders believed Parliament held supreme authority and that colonial assemblies existed only through imperial permission. They saw resistance as defiance of lawful rule, not as a principled stand for rights. This fundamental disagreement over sovereignty made reconciliation increasingly unlikely. To British officials, yielding to colonial demands would undermine the empire. To colonists, accepting British authority without representation would sacrifice their liberties. During this same period, the colonies witnessed a dramatic surge in political writing. Pamphlets, letters, and essays explored the nature of government, the purpose of liberty, and the responsibilities of citizens. Writers drew from classical sources, Enlightenment philosophy, and British legal traditions. They argued that liberty was not merely a privilege granted by rulers, but a natural right that belonged to all people. They insisted that governments existed to protect those rights, and when a government failed to do so, the people had a duty to challenge it. These ideas resonated deeply with colonists who felt their grievances had been ignored. They provided a clear and compelling explanation for why resistance was justified. They also helped unify the colonies by offering a shared language for discussing political concerns. Whether in Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, or the frontier settlements, colonists increasingly spoke of rights, freedom, and self-governance in consistent and forceful ways. The role of public gatherings also expanded during this time. Town meetings, legislative sessions, and informal assemblies became forums where people exchanged news, debated issues, and organized responses. These gatherings fostered a culture of participation that was unusual for the 18th century. In many parts of the world, political power remained concentrated in the hands of a small elite. In the colonies, by contrast, people from diverse backgrounds, farmers, artisans, merchants, and laborers contributed to political discussions. This inclusiveness gave the revolutionary movement a broad foundation of support. Such participation was not always peaceful or orderly. Tensions sometimes erupted into protests, demonstrations, or confrontations. Groups like the Sons of Liberty became symbols of active resistance. While their methods varied, their message was consistent. The colonies would not accept policies imposed without their consent. These acts of defiance, whether symbolic or direct, reinforced the belief that liberty required vigilance and courage. They also demonstrated that a significant portion of the population was willing to take risks for the sake of principle. Meanwhile, events abroad shaped colonial opinions. News of political struggles in Europe informed American debates. Many colonists admired the British Constitution for its protections of liberty and saw themselves as defending those same ideals. They argued that Britain itself was straying from its constitutional heritage. This argument allowed colonists to frame their resistance not as rebellion, but as an effort to uphold true British principles. It also allowed them to claim continuity with the long tradition of English rights. Another critical factor during this period was the experience of self-organization. As royal governments weakened or collapsed in parts of the colonies, people formed provisional assemblies, local committees, and new governing bodies. These institutions assumed responsibilities such as regulating commerce, maintaining order, and organizing defense. Their effectiveness proved that Americans were capable of self-rule. This was a powerful realization. Once colonists saw that local governance could operate without royal oversight, the idea of complete independence no longer seemed unrealistic. The psychological shift toward independence was one of the most important developments of the pre-revolutionary period. At the beginning of the crisis, few colonists imagined breaking away from Britain. They considered themselves British subjects entitled to British rights. But by the mid-1770s, the cumulative weight of grievances, debates, and experiences had changed their outlook. Many now believed that the empire no longer respected their rights or valued their contributions. Gradually, the notion of independence transformed from a distant possibility into a practical solution. It became something to be discussed, debated, and eventually pursued. By the time the colonies confronted Britain militarily, they were no longer fighting merely to repeal taxes or modify policies. They were fighting to create a new political reality based on their ideals and aspirations. This transformation laid the foundation for what would soon follow: the formal Declaration of Independence and the emergence of a new nation built upon principles of liberty, representation, and self-governance. As the movement for independence gained momentum, the colonies experienced an era of profound political experimentation. Traditional structures of authority were eroding, and new systems had not yet fully formed. This period of uncertainty, while challenging, encouraged colonists to explore questions about law, leadership, and collective responsibility. For many, it was the first time they seriously considered what a government created by, and for the people, might look like. Across the colonies, provisional congresses and committees assumed roles once held by royal officials. These bodies oversaw everything from local security to food distribution, from militia organization to dispute resolution. Their effectiveness varied, but their presence demonstrated that the colonies were capable of administering themselves. In towns and cities, citizens attended meetings, voiced concerns, and helped craft local policies. This participation strengthened civic identity and gave people a sense of ownership over the emerging political order. During this transformative period, colonists also grappled with questions of representation. Many began to argue that legitimacy came from the consent of the governed, not from hereditary authority or distant institutions. This idea, deeply rooted in Enlightenment philosophy, challenged established assumptions about political power. It encouraged colonists to imagine systems where leaders were chosen by the people, accountable to them, and removable if they failed to uphold the public interest. Debates about representation were not abstract. They were shaped by daily experiences. Farmers wanted policies that supported agricultural stability. Merchants wanted laws that protected commerce. Artisans sought reasonable regulation, while frontier settlers demanded security and access to land. The diversity of perspectives pushed political leaders to consider broader notions of inclusion and fairness. Although the emerging systems were far from perfect by modern standards, they reflected a growing belief that government must respond to the needs of its people. One of the most significant developments was the formation of the Continental Army. Before the conflict, military responsibility rested with local militias. These militias were dedicated and enthusiastic but lacked central coordination. The battles at Lexington and Concord highlighted both their strengths and limitations. In response, colonial leaders recognized the need for a unified, professionally led force capable of confronting the British Army. The decision to create the Continental Army marked a major step toward national unity. George Washington's appointment as Commander-in-Chief proved crucial. Washington's leadership provided stability, discipline, and a sense of purpose. He understood the importance of both military strategy and moral authority. His presence reassured colonists that the struggle was being guided by someone who valued restraint, integrity, and duty. Under his command, the army became a symbol of unity, representing the shared commitment of the 13 colonies to a common cause. At the same time, The colonies continued to refine their understanding of liberty. Many colonists believed that liberty required active protection. It was not enough to declare freedom. It had to be guarded through collective effort. This belief reshaped attitudes toward military service, taxation, and civic responsibility. People recognized that independence would require sacrifice economic, social, and sometimes personal. The willingness to make these sacrifices reflected a deep commitment to the principles driving the revolution. Religion also remained influential. Clergy from different denominations spoke about the conflict in moral terms. Some emphasized the importance of resisting injustice, while others cautioned against reckless actions. These sermons shaped public opinion by framing political decisions within broader ethical debates. They reminded colonists that their actions would have lasting consequences, not only for themselves but for future generations. Meanwhile, British policies continued to inflame tensions. Military campaigns, arrests of colonial leaders, and restrictions on trade convinced many colonists that the British government sought not reconciliation, but dominance. Reports of harsh treatment in occupied cities fueled anger and reinforced the belief that the colonies needed full autonomy to protect their rights. Every new development pushed more people toward the conclusion that independence was the only viable path forward. The international context also played a role. Colonists were aware that European powers, particularly France and Spain, watched the conflict closely. Some believed that foreign alliances could strengthen the colonial cause. Others feared that seeking outside assistance might compromise the principles they were fighting for. These debates revealed the complexity of building a new nation. While still engaged in conflict with one of the world's strongest empires, economic pressures intensified as well. Blockades, shortages, and inflation affected daily life. Yet these hardships often strengthened resolve. Many colonists viewed them as temporary sacrifices necessary to achieve long-term freedom. Communities organized relief efforts, supported soldiers' families, and adapted to shortages with creativity and resilience. This shared struggle deepened solidarity and reinforced the belief that independence would bring greater stability in the future. As colonial leaders drafted new state constitutions, they confronted fundamental questions. What kind of government would best protect liberty? How should power be balanced? What role should the people play? Different colonies offered different answers, but common themes emerged: elected representation, limitations on executive power, and protections for basic rights. These constitutions laid the groundwork for a political culture that valued transparency, accountability, and public participation. By the time independence was formally proposed, the colonies had already undergone a profound transformation. The shift from subjects to citizens was well underway. The political, social, and cultural foundations of a new nation were taking shape. Independence, when it came, would not be a leap into the unknown, but the culmination of years of evolving ideas and experiences. As the idea of independence moved from whispered conversations to public debate, a profound shift occurred across the colonies. What had begun as scattered acts of protest had matured into a coherent political philosophy, embraced by a significant portion of the population. This shift did not mean that all colonists agreed. Loyalty, fear, uncertainty, and cultural ties to Britain remained powerful forces. Yet supporters of independence steadily gained ground by presenting their cause as both rational and necessary. One of the defining moments of this transition was the growing recognition that British and American interests had diverged. Colonists increasingly believed that Britain viewed the empire through a lens of profit and control, while Americans valued opportunity, local autonomy, and equitable treatment. British officials often dismissed colonial expectations as unrealistic, while colonists interpreted British rigidity as evidence of indifference. This widening political, economic, and cultural gap made compromise progressively more difficult. The publication of influential writings further accelerated the shift toward independence. Pamphlets argued that monarchy was incompatible with the principles of liberty. Essays explained the dangers of hereditary power and the benefits of republican government. These ideas resonated strongly with people who had long participated in town meetings and local elections. They provided clarity at a moment when the colonies were re-examining their political identity. The most influential works helped transform independence from a risky concept into a logical solution. At the community level, debates intensified. Taverns, churches, workshops, and public squares became centers of discussion. People exchanged news, questioned assumptions, and reconsidered their loyalties. Many who had previously hoped for reconciliation began to see that the British government had little interest in meaningful reform. Conversations once driven by frustration now focused on future possibilities. What kind of nation could the colonies become? What principles would guide them? Militia activity increased during this period as well. Drills became more frequent. Supplies were gathered, and local commanders gained experience. Militias were not just military units. They were community organizations that strengthened bonds among neighbors. Participation in a militia fostered a sense of shared responsibility, encouraging people to view the defense of their rights as a collective duty. This mindset made the revolutionary cause feel personal, immediate, and deeply connected to daily life. The Continental Army continued to take shape, though it faced challenges. Supplies were limited, uniforms varied, and new recruits arrived with different levels of training. Yet the Army's very existence symbolized unity. Soldiers from different colonies fought side by side, experiencing hardships together. They developed a shared identity that transcended regional boundaries and helped cultivate a broader American consciousness. This emerging national identity was essential for the long struggle ahead. In addition to military and political changes, there was a significant transformation in social values. Colonists increasingly emphasized the importance of virtue, responsibility, and civic participation. They believed that for a republic to thrive, its citizens had to be informed, engaged, and morally grounded. These ideas shaped educational practices, family life, and public discourse. Communities encouraged one another to uphold standards that would support a stable and independent society. Events on the battlefield also influenced public opinion. News of skirmishes, losses, and victories spread quickly through newspapers and letters. Each encounter prompted questions about the future. Successes inspired optimism and pride. Setbacks reminded colonists of the difficulty of their pursuit. But the fact that colonial forces stood against one of the world's most powerful armies strengthened the belief that the fight was justified and that victory, though uncertain, was possible with determination. British actions continued to have a profound impact. Blockades, property seizures, and military engagements convinced many colonists that Britain intended to impose control by force. Stories of burned homes, occupied towns, and disrupted trade circulated widely. Even those who had once supported reconciliation began to question whether peaceful coexistence within the empire was achievable. For many, British military measures served as the final evidence that independence was the only path to secure long-term stability. Economic hardship added another layer to the unfolding drama. Inflation, shortages, and disrupted trade made daily life difficult. But these challenges often strengthened resolve rather than weakening it. Families learned to adapt, relying on local resources and community cooperation. The struggle fostered resilience and resourcefulness, qualities that would later become central to the American spirit. Many believed that while independence demanded temporary sacrifice, it promised long-term economic freedom. Meanwhile, colonial assemblies and provisional governments drafted new state constitutions. These documents reflected the principles colonists had articulated for years: representation, balance of power, and protection of individual rights. Writing a constitution required careful thought and lively debate. Leaders confronted the challenge of designing governments that avoided the abuses they associated with imperial rule. These state constitutions served as laboratories for political innovation, influencing the later creation of the national constitution. The growing support for independence was not solely a result of British actions or philosophical arguments. It was also driven by a powerful sense of destiny. Many colonists believed they were living through a pivotal moment in history. They saw themselves as both heirs to and guardians of principles that stretched back through centuries of struggle for liberty. This historical consciousness gave the movement a moral dimension. It reassured people that their sacrifices were part of a larger story about human freedom. By the spring of 1776, the colonies had reached a turning point. The desire for reconciliation had faded in most regions. The experience of resistance, political, military, and personal, had forged a new identity rooted in shared values and aspirations. Independence was no longer a theoretical idea debated by intellectuals. It had become a practical goal supported by thousands of people who believed that a new nation could be built on the foundations of liberty, justice, and democratic governance. The colonies were prepared for the next step, a formal declaration that would articulate their reasons, assert their rights, and signal their determination to shape their own future. As momentum built toward a decisive break, colonial leaders understood that mere military resistance was no longer enough. The colonies needed a unified political statement, something that would explain to the world why separation from Britain was necessary. The Continental Congress had debated independence in private for months, but now the pressure from the public, from the militias, and from events on the ground made hesitation impossible. Several colonies instructed their delegates to support independence formally. This shift was remarkable. Just a year earlier, the majority of these same delegates had hoped desperately to repair relations with Britain. But time, experience, and British policies had reshaped their views. The change reflected not only political evolution, but also a deeper emotional transformation. Colonists no longer thought of themselves primarily as British subjects, but as something distinct, something new. By early summer of 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution declaring that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. His proposal ignited intense debate, but few doubted that the moment had arrived. Delegates recognized that failing to act decisively now could fracture the fragile unity of the colonies. Many also believed that foreign support, particularly from France, would only come once independence was formally declared. To present their case clearly and convincingly, Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration. The committee included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a young Virginia delegate named Thomas Jefferson. Although all contributed to the discussion, it was Jefferson who took primary responsibility for writing the first draft. His colleagues trusted his ability to articulate complex ideas with clarity, logic, and emotional force. Jefferson began by laying out a universal principle that all human beings possess natural rights, which governments are created to protect. This idea was rooted in Enlightenment philosophy but had taken on new significance in the colonies. It provided not just a justification for independence, but a vision of what the new nation should stand for. Jefferson's words reflected the colonists' evolving belief that legitimate government must derive its authority from the consent of the governed. The draft went on to list grievances against King George III, highlighting how British policies violated these principles. Jefferson did not simply recount specific laws or taxes. He emphasized a pattern of behavior that demonstrated a fundamental disregard for colonial rights. This framing helped transform a series of economic and political disputes into a coherent argument for revolution. The message was clear. Britain had broken the social contract, and the colonies had the right and the duty to establish new governments. Congress debated the draft intensely. Delegates edited language, removed passages, and clarified arguments. These revisions were not signs of disagreement about the core message, but efforts to ensure that the document would be acceptable to all 13 colonies. Every sentence had to be precise. Every claim had to resonate. This was not merely a statement of independence, it was a declaration intended for the entire world to read and judge. During these discussions, the weight of the moment became unmistakable. The delegates knew that signing such a document was an act of treason in the eyes of the British Crown. If the revolution failed, they would face severe punishment, possibly even execution. Yet despite the risks, support for independence grew stronger with each debate. The delegates understood that their personal safety mattered less than the future of the people they represented. Outside the halls of Congress, anticipation swelled. Newspapers speculated about the coming decision. Ordinary citizens debated what independence would mean for their families, their businesses, and their communities. Some feared the consequences of war. Others saw independence as the dawn of new opportunities. The growing expectation created pressure that Congress could not ignore. The people were no longer passive observers. They were active participants in shaping their future. On July 2, 1776, Congress finally voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence. The colonies had taken a bold and irreversible step. What had begun as a series of protests over taxation and governance had evolved into a full-fledged revolution grounded in political philosophy, shared identity, and collective resolve. When the Declaration was read aloud in public squares, it was met with a mixture of celebration, reflection, and determination. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and citizens gathered to hear the words that would define a new nation. Yet beneath the excitement was the sobering knowledge that the hardest part of the struggle still lay ahead. Declaring independence was one thing. Securing it would require years of sacrifice, strategy, and unwavering commitment. Still, for many, the Declaration represented more than a political document. It was a promise that a new form of government, rooted in liberty and equality, could be born on American soil. It articulated the ideals that had motivated colonists through years of uncertainty. And it gave purpose to the long and difficult war that continued to unfold by committing themselves to independence. The colonies had transformed their rebellion into a revolution. The decision marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with immense danger but also immense possibility. With the Declaration now in hand, the colonists stepped onto the world stage ready to defend their rights, fight for their future, and attempt to build a nation unlike any the world had ever seen. The Declaration of Independence reshaped the conflict in profound ways. Before its adoption, the colonies were fighting to defend their rights within the British Empire. After July 1776, they were fighting to establish a new nation. This shift in purpose changed how the war was fought, how foreign governments viewed the conflict, and how ordinary Americans understood their role in the struggle. For many colonists, independence brought a sense of clarity. They now had a concrete goal: freedom from British rule and a unifying message that resonated across regions and social classes. But it also brought new challenges. Unity became more important than ever. The colonies needed coordinated strategies, stable leadership, reliable supplies, and international allies. Without these, independence would remain only words on paper. The Continental Army, under George Washington's command, faced enormous obstacles. Washington understood that the Army's survival was critical. If his forces were destroyed, the revolution would collapse. British troops were well-trained, well-equipped, and supported by the world's most powerful navy. The Continental Army was smaller, less trained, and often lacking basic supplies such as gunpowder, blankets, and food. Yet Washington knew that survival, not victory in every battle, was the key to success. As long as his army remained intact, the revolution lived. Ordinary Americans played a vital role in sustaining the cause. Farmers provided food, blacksmiths produced tools and weapons, and families endured hardship as their loved ones served in the militia or the Continental Army. Women stepped into roles that had traditionally been reserved for men, managing farms, running businesses, and providing vital support to soldiers. Their contributions ensured that daily life continued despite the chaos of war. Meanwhile, political leaders faced the monumental task of creating functioning state governments. Each colony-turned-state drafted constitutions that reflected the ideals expressed in the Declaration. These documents emphasized representative government, the separation of powers, and protections for individual rights. This process was messy and sometimes contentious, but it demonstrated a remarkable level of political innovation. The states were learning, in real time, how to govern themselves. Foreign involvement became increasingly important. France, still eager to weaken Britain after losing territory in the 7 Years' War, watched the unfolding rebellion closely. But French leaders were cautious. They wanted proof that the colonies could stand against Britain before committing military or financial support. The Declaration of Independence helped make the case. But battlefield success was needed to convince France that the revolution had a real chance of succeeding. Diplomats such as Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, and Arthur Lee worked tirelessly in Europe to secure foreign aid. Franklin, with his charm, wit, and reputation as a scientist and philosopher, became a symbol of American ideals. His presence in Paris helped build sympathy for the American cause among French intellectuals, politicians, and even the royal court. Yet gaining formal French support would require a turning point. Back in America, not all colonists welcomed independence. Loyalists, those who still supported Britain, feared that rebellion would lead to disorder, economic collapse, and unnecessary bloodshed. Some believed that the colonies could still negotiate a fair settlement under British rule. Others distrusted the radical leaders of the independence movement. Tensions between patriots and loyalists often turned violent, leading to personal feuds, raids, and reprisals. The revolution was not just a war between America and Britain. It was also, in many communities, a civil war. Indigenous nations faced difficult decisions as well. Many native groups depended on trade with the British and feared colonial expansion into their lands. Some sided with Britain, believing that the crown was more likely to restrain American settlers. Others sought neutrality, hoping to avoid becoming entangled in a conflict that was not of their making. Their choices would have lasting consequences long after the war ended. Enslaved Africans also found themselves caught between competing promises of freedom. British commanders sometimes offered emancipation to enslaved people who joined the British forces, hoping to weaken the colonial economy and bolster their own ranks. Some enslaved people took this opportunity, seeking a path to freedom in the chaos of war. Patriots, on the other hand, were divided. While some leaders condemned slavery, others depended on the institution and resisted any effort to reform it. The revolution inspired powerful ideals, but it also revealed deep contradictions that the new nation would struggle with for generations. As the war continued, the stakes grew higher. The colonies had declared independence, but they still needed to defend it militarily, politically, and morally. Every battle, every diplomatic effort, and every act of sacrifice contributed to a larger struggle that was now about more than rights and taxes. It was about the future of an emerging nation. The Declaration had set the course. The war would determine the outcome. The years following 1776 would test the endurance, creativity, and unity of the American people in ways they had never experienced before. Victory was far from certain, and defeat remained a constant possibility. Yet despite the uncertainty, the revolutionaries pressed forward, driven by a belief that a new kind of nation, a nation founded on principles rather than monarchy, was worth fighting for. Versine. The second half of 1776 was a sobering period for the Continental Army. After the inspirational energy of the Declaration of Independence, the realities of war became painfully clear. British forces launched a massive campaign to seize control of New York City, a strategic port that would give them access to the interior of the colonies and divide New England from the rest of America. General William Howe arrived with one of the largest expeditionary forces Britain had ever deployed. Tens of thousands of soldiers, supported by a powerful navy, anchored off Staten Island. The British expected a quick victory. In their view, the Continental Army was poorly trained, poorly supplied, and no match for the disciplined regiments of the Crown. George Washington recognized the danger but also understood the political necessity of defending New York. The city was a symbol of colonial unity and economic power. Abandoning it without a fight could demoralize the colonies and undermine confidence in the new government. Yet Washington knew his army was vulnerable. Many soldiers were inexperienced, enlistments were short, and supplies were scarce. Nevertheless, he prepared for the British assault as best he could. The campaign unfolded disastrously for the Americans. At the Battle of Long Island in August 1776, British troops executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, crushing the American forces and forcing Washington into a difficult retreat. It was the largest battle of the entire war, and it exposed the Continental Army's weaknesses. Washington barely managed to save his army by evacuating his troops across the East River under cover of night and heavy fog, an escape that would become legendary. The loss of New York marked a turning point. Over the next several months, Washington was forced into a series of retreats across New Jersey. Each withdrawal sapped morale. Soldiers deserted. Supplies dwindled. Confidence in the revolutionary cause weakened. Newspapers questioned Washington's leadership, and some members of Congress feared the revolution would collapse before it truly began. For many colonists, independence suddenly seemed fragile, yet this period also revealed Washington's greatest strength not as a battlefield tactician, but as a leader who understood the broader purpose of the war. His strategy of preservation frustrated British commanders, who expected decisive confrontations. Washington avoided unnecessary battles, knowing that one catastrophic defeat could end the revolution. By keeping the Continental Army alive, he kept the hope of independence alive. This strategy reflected a deeper reality. The American cause did not need to defeat Britain outright in every engagement. It simply needed to survive long enough for political, diplomatic, and military pressures to shift in its favor. Britain had to win quickly to justify the immense cost of the war. The colonies only needed to avoid defeat. Washington grasped this distinction and shaped his decisions around it. As the winter of 1776 approached, the situation became dire. British and Hessian forces occupied key cities. Loyalist sentiment grew in some regions, and enlistments in the Continental Army were due to expire at the end of the year. If Washington could not deliver a victory soon, the army might dissolve entirely, but hardship also created opportunity. British forces had grown complacent, believing the Americans were defeated. Their troops were spread out across New Jersey in winter quarters, confident that the conflict would soon end. Washington saw a chance to strike a dramatic blow, not to win the war outright, but to restore morale and prove that the revolutionary cause still had life. Meanwhile, political leaders continued to build the framework of a new nation. The Continental Congress worked to maintain unity among the states, manage currency shortages, and send urgent requests for supplies to state governments. These efforts were imperfect and often slow, but they kept the revolutionary government functioning during the darkest moments of the war. Ordinary citizens played a crucial role as well. Farmers supplied food to the army despite receiving depreciated currency. Local militias formed to harass British foraging parties. Communities sheltered soldiers, aided couriers, and shared intelligence. These acts of support sustained the revolution during its most vulnerable phase, even as military setbacks mounted. The powerful ideas expressed in the Declaration of Independence continued to inspire people. Sermons, pamphlets, and public readings reinforced the belief that the struggle was about more than territory or taxes. It was a fight for fundamental rights and a new form of government. This sense of purpose helped keep the cause alive when circumstances seemed hopeless. As 1776 came to an end, the revolution stood at a crossroads. Britain appeared to hold the advantage, yet Washington recognized that the war was far from over. He prepared to launch a bold and desperate counterstrike across the icy Delaware River, an operation that would soon transform the course of the conflict. The coming events would not only revive American morale but also demonstrate that the revolutionary spirit could survive even the harshest adversity. The winter campaign ahead would prove that the desire for independence, once ignited, could not be extinguished by defeat, doubt, or overwhelming odds. The final days of 1776 were some of the bleakest in the entire struggle for independence. Cold winds swept across the Delaware Valley, and the Continental Army, exhausted, underfed, and poorly clothed, camped on the western side of the river. Many soldiers were sick. Many more were ready to quit. Their enlistments would expire at the end of December, and without a convincing victory, the army might simply vanish. Washington understood that time was slipping away. He recognized that the revolution needed not just survival, but inspiration, something that would reignite belief among soldiers and civilians alike. A daring strike could achieve what months of retreat had nearly undone: restore confidence, attract new recruits, and prove that independence was still attainable. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington made his move. He planned a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, a small New Jersey town occupied by a disciplined force of German auxiliaries fighting for the British. The Hessians were known for their toughness, but they were also isolated. And British commanders believed the Americans were incapable of launching any meaningful assault in the dead of winter. The plan required absolute secrecy and extraordinary courage. Washington intended to cross the icy Delaware River under cover of darkness, march his troops 9 miles through snow and freezing rain, and then strike at dawn. The risks were enormous. If the attack failed, the Continental Army could be destroyed. But if it succeeded, the psychological impact would be profound. As night fell, soldiers wrapped rags around their feet to protect themselves from the cold. Boats slipped into the river, guided by experienced watermen from Pennsylvania. The crossing was treacherous. Sheets of ice crashed against the boats, and men struggled to keep their footing. Some artillery pieces nearly fell into the river. The operation took hours longer than expected, and Washington feared the element of surprise would be lost. But the weather, brutal as it was, worked to Washington's advantage. The storm kept the Hessians off guard. They did not expect any attack in such conditions. When the Continental Army finally reached the outskirts of Trenton on the morning of December 26th, the Hessians were completely unprepared. The ensuing battle was swift and decisive. Washington's troops attacked from multiple directions, overwhelming the garrison. The Hessian commander, Colonel Johann Rall, was mortally wounded, and his troops surrendered. Nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers were captured. Remarkably, the Americans suffered very few casualties. The victory electrified the colonies. Newspapers across the states printed enthusiastic accounts of the daring attack. Civilians who had begun to lose hope now felt renewed faith in the cause. Enrollment in the Continental Army surged. Congress praised Washington's leadership, and the revolution on the brink of collapse just weeks earlier gained new life. But Washington was not finished. Understanding the importance of momentum, he launched another bold strike just days later. On January 3, 1777, he confronted British forces at Princeton. The battle was fierce, and at one point the Continental Army came close to breaking. But Washington, in one of the most dramatic moments of the war, rode to the front lines and rallied his troops personally. His calm presence under fire inspired the soldiers, and the battle ended in another American victory. These twin victories at Trenton and Princeton reshaped the war. They forced the British to withdraw from much of New Jersey and created a buffer between the enemy and the vital political center of Philadelphia. More importantly, they proved that the Continental Army could defeat professional troops. This realization transformed how Americans and the British viewed the conflict. The victories also reinforced Washington's strategic vision. He understood that the revolution's success depended not on constantly winning large battles, but on avoiding destruction, striking when opportunities arose, and keeping the political will for independence alive. Trenton and Princeton demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach. Meanwhile, the broader struggle for independence continued to evolve. Local militias grew more confident, pressing British detachments across the countryside. Patriot-controlled towns and counties re-established functioning governments. The revolutionary movement became more organized and more resilient, yet the war was still far from won. Britain remained determined to crush the rebellion, and 1777 would bring new challenges, including a massive British campaign designed to isolate New England. The coming year would test American resolve once again, but for the moment, the colonies had something invaluable: hope. The impossible had been achieved. A ragged army on the brink of dissolution had struck 2 stunning blows against the world's most powerful empire. These victories did more than win battles. They revived a revolution.